let's try to tackle whipped cream. So I've got a cherry and I've got whipped cream. As usual, I want to go from light to dark because I can always add, but it is so much more difficult to subtract. So I've done my line art, which means next I'm going to start with the Cool Whip, which has lighter value scale overall. The cherry is going to be somewhat darker, so let's start with this. First thing first, laying down a solid bed of the median gray. Where's the lightest value in the whipped cream? Recognize it, and then duplicate it by putting a wash of it across the whole thing. And keeping the line work tight so it's easier to blend. If I'm too sporadic and inconsistent, it'll be much harder to smooth out and hide the pencil strokes. But of course, that's my goal because whipped cream certainly shouldn't look like it's thatched from hay or grass. So we gotta try to blend that out. And again, I'm erring on the side of caution. I can always get it darker, but best to start off as light as possible. Because while contrast is your goal in all your drawings to make certain it pops from the page, the whipped cream doesn't have a lot of contrast between its values. It's a really subtle shift from one to the next. Creating a three-dimensional peak might involve just showing the difference between, say, values 1, 2, and 3 on the value scale. Nothing too dramatic. I'm going to blend as I go. Because before I start getting darker, building up those values, I want to make certain that I've got a smooth, solid foundation to work with before I risk making it harder to blend with each subsequent layer. I kept my line work really light so that I wouldn't have a sort of cartoonish outline around the final product. Because of course, those outlines don't exist in real life, but because it's so light, I also risk obscuring it entirely and not being able to see my work. My guideposts, as the values get darker. Yet another reason why I don't want to get too dark too quickly, or I sort of lose my outlines entirely. It's the goal at the end, but not exactly helpful in the beginning. Okay, so part 2, well, where does it get lighter? Where does it get darker? If I need things to get lighter, I can always go in with an eraser and pull out some of those darker values. And of course, things need to get darker, and I need to gauge how much darker and where does that happen. So let's see here. To suggest those folds, that dimension, I gotta try to find as much value variation as possible and duplicate it. And because we're dealing with such soft folds and peaks, such as Cool Whip, I probably don't want to get so overstated as necessarily reaching for a new pencil, as rather just maybe applying a little more pressure to get those darker values. Reaching for a 2B, a 6, and 8B, that might be overkill and leave me with whipped cream that looks like it is made out of charcoal. Okay, so my goal was to try to track down the values that just get slightly darker than the first gray that I laid down as my base. Now I gotta try to find out where it gets darker still. Where do I go revisit these values and push them even further? That additional contrast, again, is gonna make them pop. The more values I have, the more three-dimensional my objects become. Okay. And maybe, as long as I'm careful enough, I'm subdued enough, maybe I can use a slightly darker pencil. Just make certain I don't press too hard. As you can see by contrast, a little goes a long way here. Looks like this could use a little more smoothing and a little more touch-up with an eraser to pull out some of the areas that got a little too dark that shouldn't be. But it looks like we're about ready to move on to the cherry and then revisit this whipped cream at the end to see if, by contrast, it needs to get lighter or darker when we start comparing it to the surrounding value scales. But that is a pretty decent start. Remember, the more value you've got, the more dimension you're going to lend the object, and the more it will leap from the page. Just do a little touch-up. Show us where those lighter values are, but don't leap into overkill because, of course, pure white, like blinding paper white, is reserved for extreme highlights or light as intense as, say, staring into the center of the sun. All right. Not bad. All right. That's all for now, and let's pick up where we left off in our next video.